think my reaction is wow. I have a lot of notes, but I think I'm going to say somewhat different things after what has been said just now. First of all, I'm going to speak as I had a little note I was going to speak from a U.S. point of view. Certainly, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to speak as a U.S. national, though. I think one's first reaction to what Sahel and Nadim have said is, let's leave. It's their problem. Let them figure it out. And of course, the latter is true, is that we're not going to figure out as foreigners how you solve all of these problems. We walked away from Afghanistan, and we weren't terribly happy with the results. We soon may be ready to walk away again, and I don't think we'll be happy with the results then either. I want to comment that there are plenty of other countries in a similar position. I've done over the years a lot of work in Nepal. My wife has considerable business relations there. Nepal's a complete mess at the present time, just a complete mess. There's probably less. It's probably a smaller group of intellectuals in Nepal, so you don't hear about it quite as much, and it doesn't get put so eloquently. And there are plenty of countries in Africa that are a complete mess. And one has to wonder a little bit, why are there so many countries in a big mess now? We weren't having big messes in the late 1950s, the 60s, and the 70s. And I want to make some comments about what foreign aid can and cannot do in these contexts. I want to make a comment on this business of long-term. It's very difficult as an American national concerned with foreign aid to ever use the term long-term with respect to our foreign aid in either Pakistan or Afghanistan. And there's good reason for that. In both cases, we may not be there in a year or 2 years. So what's the point of thinking about things that take 10 or 15 years if you're only going to be there a year and a half or 2 years? By the way, as an aside, my father-in-law, who was the chief general in the Afghanistan Army in the 1970s, was extremely happy when the U.S. moved into Afghanistan. And he was not surprised that it went so quickly and so well in terms of what we were trying to do at that time. He said to me, and while being very happy about this, that you people have 5 years to train a 150,000-person Afghan army and get out. When he was chief of the army, they had 80,000 troops. He thought it was more complicated. Now you need 150,000. Well, we're close to 3 years beyond his 5-year limit, and we're not doing very well at the present time. And we're certainly a lot less welcome now than we were even 3 years ago. Now, the comment I want to make on long-term, let me just give a little quote. I was talking to the director of agriculture in Patika, one of the southeastern provinces in Afghanistan, and they have a completely run-down agricultural research station there. You can't talk about doing agricultural research in Afghanistan because that's long-term. They had a rundown. And by the way, the U.S. strategy for agriculture in Afghanistan has extension in it, but no research. How in the world can you do extension without any applied research behind it to come up with the stuff that you're going to extend? I asked the director of agriculture what he thought about rehabilitating the research station, and he said that it would instantly greatly increase the respect that farmers have for me and the government. That's quick results. You put some machinery out there and start rehabilitating that station, and immediately farmers begin to think about the 1970s. And by the way, when I talk to farmers in Afghanistan, this is relevant to Pakistan shortly. When I talk to farmers in Afghanistan, nobody talked about the 1970s. Why? Because they were looking at a bright future ahead. Now, when you talk to farmers in Afghanistan, they look with great nostalgia back in the 1970s, when they had an agricultural credit system that was one of the best in Asia, and which the donors destroyed about 2 years ago, completely destroyed it. A well-operating institution. They had a well-operating extension service. They had research farms in every province. They had a central government that would send an army here and there as necessary if there were border problems, and so on. So there's great nostalgia for that, and they keep mentioning things that if we did something to immediately revive those things, the farmers don't have to wait for the results to come. They simply see that, hey, we're getting back to where we were, and when we get back to there, we can move ahead. Another side comment on this, and I want to come then specifically to the Pakistan situation. You ask farmers what they want, and 2 or 3 things pop up. First of all, they would like to feel that their government was working for them. And you ask them now, and they say, oh, all the good things are done by the NGOs. NGO means foreigners, basically. And they'll be gone soon, and then there's nothing. So that when local people get good things from foreigners who are soon going to be gone, that has no relevance to the short term or the long term. They take what they can from it, but they know it won't be around long, and they know their government isn't doing anything. So that one of the things you have to think about is how you do things so that you build up government capacities and the governments get credit, and get the NGOs as NGOs out of there. They can do the work, but they have to do it properly in this context. So I want to, what I most want to emphasize is that the comments I'm going to make are all what get pushed aside as long-term, but they would all give immediate change in attitudes and support. I want to make a quick comment on SWAT, and then I want to talk about the whole question of food insecurity and so on. I think I'm correct in what I'm going to say now, although this point wasn't made by the speakers, that in SWAT, I know more about SWAT than Buner, so I'll talk about SWAT. In SWAT, the government system had basically broken down, as both speakers have made clear. You couldn't get justice. There wasn't very good law and order. And just as in Afghanistan some years ago, when the Taliban came in, there wasn't a great deal of resistance because I think the feeling was this isn't going to be any worse, and it might be a lot better. Very quickly, the Taliban completely discredited themselves. I'm not sure that I'm correct in this statement, but I think the Taliban in Pakistan have been more vicious than the Taliban in Afghanistan. So that in SWAT there was great unhappiness about them, and great happiness that they may be driven out. And you're making it clear maybe that hasn't completely succeeded as yet. I'm making this point because if the U.S. wanted to do something helpful, we have, from the point of view of what we consider our foreign policy interests, which is to get rid of al-Qaeda and, in a sense, Taliban as well, there's a very favorable situation in SWAT for achieving that. Now, there are people that talk about doing development so that security can follow it. Well, that's complete nonsense. You get security, and then, if you're lucky, you can do development. So my comments about SWAT assume that security has been restored and that one can then start doing development. SWAT is an area with extremely good resource base for high incomes and development. They had high incomes there, moderately high incomes at least, in Swat. And there are two big sources of income. Number one, tourism. It's a great tourism spot, and the tourism is of course, very heavily Pakistani tourism. It's not big scale. There are international tourists, or were, but that's not the major driving force. So it's domestic tourism, and then, of course, high-value agriculture, tremendous potentials in the various types of perennial horticultural commodities. So that what the U.S. should have been doing is to gird itself up and get ready as security is provided, which may be the case in the southern part of Swat already, to move in with huge resources, with the government of Pakistan as much as it can up front, and at least local officials up front, with a major push on development. And that development has to be commercial agriculture. Commercial means small-scale commercial, obviously, not large-scale commercial. And the tourism. And there are a whole flock of investments that one can make in order to achieve that. As far as I know, there's no plan on the U.S. part to do that. If you did that, you would almost certainly succeed because they're very favorable. It's a very favorable resource base, including the human resources, for doing that. And you would send a message that when the Taliban are cleared out of a place, great prosperity ensues. And you want to send that message from a place where it's easy to do it. And that's the case in Swat. It'd be very easy to succeed there. That doesn't happen because of an interaction of lack of vision and lack of technical competence. I don't want to talk about AID because AID is a bit player in all of these things now. I want to talk about U.S. foreign assistance, whoever may be running it at a particular moment in time. I don't encounter any people with any real vision as to where you want to get to in the longer run. That's, again, because of this antipathy towards long-term, even though the long-term things have immediate impact on people's perceptions and so on. And that interacts with a complete lack of technical competence. You can find hardly anybody in aid. There's a hard person, Stu, you must be here somewhere. There's an odd person here and there who does have some technical knowledge, but it's basically gone from the American aid programs, and not just from U.S. aid. There's very little technical competence with respect to developing countries in the United States Department of Agriculture, which is now to which the agriculture is gradually being transferred. So you get this interaction of no vision and no technical knowledge. You can't even talk about how you would rehabilitate Swat in a situation like that. I want to make some quick comments on the food security thing, and here I'm sure I'll get a lot of objection to what I'm trying to say. That the whole question of putting in safety nets and so on, I don't want to address. That's basically an internal political issue, one in which we have a lot of interest. By the way, I'm reminded of another anecdote here in the context of what was said earlier. Sahel very kindly arranged a meeting for me, I think this was probably last December, to meet with an extremely distinguished group of probably 20-odd Pakistanis who were very knowledgeable about agricultural growth and what should be done. And by the way, Pakistan is a country where you can put together 20 people who are very good on these issues. When the head of the Economic Growth Unit in aid found out that I was having this meeting, she said she would like to be invited. I was very reluctant to do it because I thought this had been arranged for me, and I thought it was going to be a fairly open discussion, and having an official might not be a great idea. But I said I'd see what I could do, and I did arrange it. She came. In the middle of the meeting, she stood up and went on at great length how there was no strategic vision about agriculture in the government. Okay, more or less correct. No strategic vision in the government with respect to energy policy. More or less correct. She had another one. More or less correct. And then she ended, and why is that? In a very arrogant tone of voice, and sat down. And one of the participants in the meeting, one of the Pakistanis there, hesitated for a moment and then said, "Madam, the reason for that is every time we have a government that starts to do that kind of institutional development, you people step in and destroy it." Well, that was probably a slight exaggeration, but the U.S. has been very supportive when military governments have come in. You have a government which raises 10% of GDP for the public sector. I complain a lot about Guatemala, which is about a percentage point better than Pakistan on this. And Pakistan has a huge military budget. Well, if you have 10% of your GDP goes into government hands, and you spend a high proportion on military, you don't do much education along the line. And certainly, the U.S. has been very complicit in all of that. But I just want to make two quick points on the food insecurity issue. And this is a little bit combative, I'm afraid. The food insecurity problem currently, and this is normally the case, is basically an issue of demand for food globally expanding more rapidly than supply and putting upward pressure on prices. That's exacerbated by subsidizing of use of food for energy creation. That's a food supply problem, basically. It can only be solved by accelerating the agricultural growth rate, and particularly the growth rate of food production. The U.S. and other donors have basically given up completely on agriculture over the last few decades. There's a modest movement back at the present time. We don't know how long it'll last, but it's here for the moment. But basically, we were very heavy on agricultural growth back in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, and then gradually got out, and we're back, and we and the other donors are almost completely out of agriculture at the present time, a little bit coming back here and there. What little there is mostly on the marketing side, essentially none on the production side. Now, why is that? There are a lot of very complicated reasons for it. I want to, in being a little combative, I want to indicate the two intellectual sources of that. It's both political and intellectual that explain it. Number one, on the intellectual side, Amartya Sen, perhaps not quite fair to him, but he's interpreted as saying that the problem of lack of food and starvation and famine is not a production problem, it's an income problem. Well, that encourages not to do anything about the production problem. If it's not a production problem, why are we worrying about production? Why don't we worry entirely about how we get incomes into the hands of poor people? And that's what you'll see most rural development is all about. You get the different view of alternative livelihoods running around. What is alternative livelihoods? It's everything in the rural sector except agriculture. And therefore, you're not worrying about the supply side whatsoever. The Amartya Sen push, which said it's an income problem, not a food problem. By the way, it's significantly an income problem. Poor people don't have any income. What Amartya misses is the most important source of income for poor people in rural areas of developing countries is producing non-tradable goods and services that have a high employment content. The only effective demand for that, there's a little bit from tourism and so on, but the only effective demand from that comes from rising incomes of farmers. So that the only way the poor can get income, this is where we're talking about 80% of the poor, the only way they can get income is for farmers to be prospering, so they spend half of their incremental income, which is what they do in the rural non-farm sector. Now, the Sen intellectual push away from agricultural production was, of course, hugely reinforced and probably hitting the popular press more by the World Bank, which has consistently said that poverty reduction is a function of the rate of economic growth. First of all, that's a half-truth. Poverty reduction is a function of the structure of economic growth. And all of the bank stuff, Martin Revalian and so on, the DFID stuff from Thurtle, lots of stuff out of IFPRI, show pretty clearly that it's Peter Timmer's work from Harvard when he was there and so on. All this shows very clearly that manufacturing growth does almost nothing to reduce poverty, and agricultural growth does a huge amount to reduce poverty. Okay, the big change, I started out with this comment, the big change in the world in foreign aid from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when governments were moving along reasonably well, to now, is we've given up on agriculture. And it seems to me perfectly reasonable to think there's a causal connection between those two. When you give up on agriculture, and by the way, no Asian countries, 1 minute, no Asian countries in the 50s and 60s was eager to do agriculture. They were all urban oriented. They wanted to do the urban sector. Foreign aid pushed them to do far more in agriculture than they wanted to do. That's still true in most African countries. They're coming around a little bit, but foreign aid doesn't push them to do more in the agricultural sector. So there's been a huge change. And if you don't push agriculture, you don't get poverty coming down. And that certainly creates a favorable environment for the kinds of messes that were talked about here. I'm not the last one to say that it's entirely due to that. So my comment on the food insecurity vulnerability is that you can't solve those problems except by accelerating the agricultural growth rate. And that has to include food production in it, not exclusively food, but it has to include food production in it. And if you're neglecting your agricultural sector, you're going to have a very difficult time protecting your poor. You can, with food aid, if you're a politically important country, most African countries are not politically important, and therefore, when there's a food crisis, food aid drops to those countries because the price of food goes up. There isn't as much tonnage available, and they get shortcutted in that process. So that from a global point of view, you've got to get the agricultural production side moving, and that more or less applies to individual countries as well, unless they're bailed out through foreign aid that goes to them instead of to some other countries. Thank you.